Most people carry a quiet hope about human nature. The belief that people eventually change, that the angry person will one day learn control, that the manipulator will eventually feel remorse, that the person who keeps hurting others will finally wake up and become someone different. It's a comforting idea. But history and careful observation of human behavior tells a different story. Niccolò Machiavelli understood something most people avoid admitting. Patterns in human nature are far more stable than we like to believe. People don't usually transform. What happens instead is slower and more subtle. Over time, they simply reveal who they have always been. And this realization often arrives in painful ways. A friend who keeps exploding in anger no matter how many times they promise to change. Someone who agrees with you today, but betrays you tomorrow the moment the environment changes. A person who disappears the second there is nothing to gain from you. At first, we call it a phase, then stress, then misunderstanding. But after enough time, something uncomfortable becomes impossible to ignore. It's not a phase, it's a pattern, and patterns matter more than promises. One of Machiavelli's greatest insights was that human behavior tends to organize itself into predictable structures, not moral categories, structural ones. Certain personalities operate in cycles they rarely escape, not because they are evil, not because no one tried to help them, but because their internal architecture simply does not support real change. This is where many people lose years of their lives. They try to teach self-control to someone who never developed self-observation. They try to build trust with someone whose identity shifts depending on who is watching. They try to invest in someone who only understands immediate advantage. The effort feels noble, but it quietly drains time, energy, and emotional stability. Machiavelli didn't waste time fighting patterns that had already revealed themselves. He watched carefully. He categorized behavior. And once a pattern became clear, he adjusted his expectations to reality, not hope. That shift alone changes everything. Because the moment you stop trying to transform the unchangeable, something powerful happens. You reclaim your attention. You stop explaining the obvious. You stop negotiating with cycles. You stop waiting for the next apology that will sound sincere but change nothing. Instead, you begin to see people as they truly operate. And once you see the pattern clearly, disappointment loses much of its power. There are 3 types of people Machiavelli repeatedly observed. Structures of personality that almost never evolve in the way people expect. Recognizing them doesn't make you cynical, it makes you strategic. And strategy begins with seeing reality without illusion. If this way of understanding human behavior resonates with you, subscribe to the channel. Because the more clearly you understand people, the less control their patterns have over your life. One of the most exhausting types of people you will ever encounter is the chronically reactive person. At first, they don't seem dangerous. In fact, many of them appear passionate, intense, even honest. They say what they feel. They react quickly. They show emotion without filters. And in the beginning, that intensity can even feel refreshing. But over time, a pattern begins to reveal itself. With this type of person, every emotion becomes an action. Frustration becomes aggression. Insecurity becomes accusation. Jealousy becomes control. Stress becomes conflict. There is no space between feeling and reacting. And that space, that small psychological gap between stimulus and response, is where emotional maturity lives. The chronically reactive person never develops that gap. They operate almost entirely on emotional autopilot. If they feel attacked, they attack back. If they feel embarrassed, they lash out. If they feel insecure, they create chaos around them. Later, when the emotional storm passes, something predictable usually happens. They apologize, sometimes sincerely. They promise it won't happen again. They explain that they were stressed, tired, overwhelmed. And in that moment, the apology often feels real, because it is. But sincerity in the moment does not mean structural change. The key insight Machiavelli understood is that people like this rarely learn from consequences. Not because they refuse to change, but because they lack the internal awareness required to observe their own behavior. Self-correction requires self-observation, and someone trapped in constant reaction has no distance from their own impulses. They experience emotions as commands. So the cycle repeats: explosion, apology, promise, explosion again. Years pass. But something strange remains constant. The emotional intensity never decreases. The anger today has the same temperature it had 5 years ago. The jealousy feels just as overwhelming. The frustration explodes just as quickly. Machiavelli noticed that patterns reinforced by repetition become identity. And when reacting becomes someone's identity, change becomes extremely unlikely. Not impossible, but increasingly rare. This is why many people become trapped for years trying to help someone develop emotional control. They explain, they forgive, they give chances, but the structure never shifts. And the most painful realization eventually arrives. You are not dealing with a temporary phase. You are dealing with a stable psychological pattern. Recognizing the chronically reactive person is not about judging them. It is about understanding the limits of what you can expect. Because the moment you stop expecting emotional stability from someone who has never shown it, something changes. You stop being surprised. And that alone can save you years of frustration. Another type Machiavelli observed is more subtle. At first, this person seems agreeable, flexible, even supportive. They rarely create conflict. They often appear understanding, open-minded, easy to be around. But over time, something strange begins to appear. Their opinions constantly change. What they strongly defended yesterday becomes negotiable today. What they promised last week quietly disappears when the environment shifts. And at first, it's confusing. You wonder if they changed their mind, if new information convinced them, if circumstances simply evolved. But after watching carefully, a deeper pattern becomes visible. Their positions don't come from internal conviction. They come from external approval. This is the validation-dependent person. Their identity is not built from stable internal values. It is built from the reactions of the people around them. When they are with you, they mirror your perspective. When they move to another group, they mirror that group instead. And the most surprising part is this: they are usually not lying intentionally. Each version of them is sincere in the moment, because their mind automatically adjusts to whatever environment offers the most acceptance. Machiavelli noticed that these individuals often appear adaptable, but their adaptability is not strategic. It is psychological dependence. They don't anchor themselves internally. They anchor themselves socially. This creates a pattern that many people misinterpret as betrayal. But betrayal requires conscious intent. In this case, something else is happening. There is simply no stable center holding their identity in place, so their behavior follows the strongest social gravity around them. If the room approves of you, they support you. If the room turns against you, they quietly reposition themselves, not out of cruelty, out of an unconscious need to remain accepted. This is why people who depend on validation often appear trustworthy at first. They are agreeable, they are supportive, they rarely challenge anyone directly. But the moment pressure appears, their position begins to shift. Machiavelli understood that expecting consistency from someone whose identity is externally constructed leads to endless frustration. Because consistency requires something they never built: an internal reference point. The validation-dependent person does not truly evolve. They simply adapt to whichever audience is closest. And the clearer you see this pattern, the easier it becomes to understand a confusing reality of human behavior. Some people don't change their beliefs. They only change their audience. The third type Machiavelli observed is often misunderstood, not because their behavior is hidden, but because people keep expecting something from them that they simply do not possess. This is the short-term opportunist. Their logic is simple. If there is an immediate benefit, they move. If there isn't, they disappear. Everything in their decision-making revolves around short-term advantage. At first, this type can look extremely helpful. They show up when opportunities are visible. They participate when something can be gained. They appear engaged when the situation is profitable. But watch what happens when the dynamic changes. The moment there is nothing to gain in the present, their energy fades. When you need help but cannot offer something in return, they become distant. When a situation requires loyalty without immediate reward, they lose interest. And it rarely happens with confrontation. It happens with absence. They simply stop appearing. Not because they necessarily wish harm, but because their mind processes relationships through a very narrow lens: immediate return. Machiavelli noticed that these individuals struggle with something that many people assume is natural: the ability to think in long-term value. Concepts like loyalty, reputation, and trust require patience. They require the ability to invest effort now for benefits that may only appear later. But the short-term opportunist operates almost entirely in the present. For them, value must be visible right now. If the reward is delayed, uncertain, or abstract, the motivation disappears. This is why they often seem reliable in good times. When success, opportunity, or status is visible, they are present and engaged. But the moment circumstances require sacrifice, patience, or faith in future outcomes, the pattern reveals itself. They drift away, not dramatically, just quietly. Machiavelli did not view this type as immoral. He saw them as structurally limited. Their thinking rarely moves beyond the immediate horizon. And expecting long-term loyalty from someone who cannot mentally process long-term value is one of the most common strategic mistakes people make. Because from their perspective, relationships are not investments. They are transactions. And transactions only make sense when the return is immediate. Once you recognize this pattern, their behavior becomes predictable. Presence when there is advantage, distance when there isn't. Not a mystery, just a structure repeating itself. At first, realizing that some people rarely change can feel uncomfortable. It challenges one of the most comforting beliefs we grow up with: the idea that patience, understanding, and effort can transform anyone. But Machiavelli saw this differently. To him, recognizing human patterns was not pessimism, it was clarity. Because once you understand how certain personalities operate, something powerful happens. You stop wasting energy fighting reality. You stop trying to teach emotional control to someone who has never learned self-observation. You stop expecting consistency from someone whose identity changes with the audience. You stop demanding loyalty from someone who only understands immediate advantage. And when you stop expecting what people cannot give, frustration begins to disappear. Not because the world suddenly changes, but because your expectations align with reality. Machiavelli didn't try to reshape every person he encountered. He focused on something far more strategic: understanding who could be trusted with influence, who should be kept at a distance, and who should never be placed in positions that require stability. This mindset creates a quiet kind of freedom. You become more careful with your time, more precise with your trust, more intentional about where you invest your energy, and something interesting begins to happen. When you stop trying to fix the wrong people, you suddenly have space to recognize the right ones, the rare individuals who do reflect on themselves, who can control their impulses, who understand loyalty and long-term value. Those people exist, but many never notice them because they are too busy trying to repair patterns that were never going to change. Machiavelli's lesson was never about becoming cold or cynical. It was about becoming aware, understanding people as they truly are, not as we hope they will be. Because clarity about human nature doesn't make you harsh, it makes you strategic. And strategy, more than anything else, protects your time, your peace, and your future. If this perspective made you see people a little more clearly, There's another video on your screen right now that explores one of Machiavelli's most powerful insights about human behavior and influence. Click on that video and continue watching, because the more you understand how people truly operate, the easier it becomes to move through the world with confidence.